So I know a couple of you saw the title and you're trying to figure out what it really means. So I'm going to start with this. Do you guys think that these people are similar? By the laugh, I would say no. Are these two similar? No. What about these two? Yeah, definitely not. All right. So I think we all agree in this room that they aren't. So then I'm going to pose to you this question. Why then do researchers study mostly males when developing therapies for both sexes, really leaving many high and dry? Now I'm going to get a little bit more into this. So we know that men and women are not similar. We know this. Now here's a slide where I will tell you that there are some key differences between men and women when it comes to, for example, how they can manifest disease differently. Think of heart attack, one of the most basic things. So men have the classic chest pain with pain radiating down the arm. Women typically present in an atypical manner. So there's one common disease, just to show you that yes, men and women can present differently. They can experience diseases differently. They can respond to drugs differently, metabolize drugs differently, respond to devices. We certainly know a female hip is very different than a male hip if you're going to have a replacement, right? And then also can have different outcomes, believe it or not, after surgical and medical therapies. Here is a slide that just shows some common diseases that have known sex and gender-based differences. Now in this room, I probably don't need to point out the difference, but I will anyways because I always do. So throughout this talk, I am referring to sex, our chromosomal difference. I'm not referring to gender, the phenotype by which we present ourselves. So this is chromosomal sex for this talk. So if these are some known diseases that have sex and or gender differences. So I'm a vascular surgeon, and so we'll go down here to this one, heart disease. All right, let me show you a couple facts about this. So here's a graph from the American Heart Association, and this is the incidence of cardiovascular disease by age and sex. So one of their common graphs. And I'm going to guess that most of you in this room have an appreciation that the incidence of cardiovascular disease goes up as we age, and that typically it's higher in males than females. Pretty much, do we all have that same appreciation? However, did you realize that more females die from the disease than males? So right there, a big difference between the sexes. And a lot of people don't realize this. A lot of people just assume because the incidence is higher in men that more men are dying. Now, what about some differences in drugs? And again, I'm just going to focus on my own area. So some drugs that I would commonly prescribe. So aspirin. So like vitamin A to me. So aspirin, we know, has big differences between men and women. In fact, it's recommended for men for prophylaxis, right, against heart attack and stroke at the age of 50. It is not for women. So a common drug like that has some big differences between the sexes. Statins, more beneficial in men for primary prevention, but a greater risk of adverse reaction in women. Angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors cause more adverse effects in women. Digoxin, taken to help control your rate, associated with increased mortality in women. And then warfarin, a blood thinner, also Coumadin. So it usually requires lower doses in women. These are just some of the common drugs in my clinical domain, okay? So it might get your gears going as you guys are thinking, okay, well, what about other drugs in other areas? Right. So it gets to this question. Why, after the little bit of information I just showed you, then are men and women given the same drug for a disease? And why are they given the same dose of a drug? So in this room, can any of you think of a drug that is dosed differently based on sex? And do not give me testosterone, give me or estrogen. But can any of you think of a drug, seriously, that is prescribed at a different dose, just simply based on sex? Right? So I'm going to tell you we got one. One now. So Ambien. So this is a very interesting story. So Ambien is a sleep-inducing medication. And what happened, so Ambien's been on the market, FDA approved since like the early 90s. What happened is several years ago, there started to be more reports of women who were taking the drug the next day having automobile accidents. So as you can imagine, I'm sure this room has already jumped to that conclusion, they investigated and found that yes, women metabolize the drug more slowly. So the next day when they were getting behind the wheel, many still had it in their system. So that's a pretty big deal. That led, for the first time ever, the FDA issued a label change. And now Ambien is recommended half the dose for women. So 10 milligrams for men, 5 milligrams for women. That's one drug, you guys. How many other drugs do we think that this needs to occur for? Now, how did we get to this point? All right, so I would say, in my opinion, there's a couple different reasons. So one, women have been poorly represented historically in clinical trials. I'll get back to this in a minute. Sex-based differences have really not been specifically sought out or a focus in our research community. Sex-based differences are not often reported in published manuscripts. Now, it was recognized, I think many in this room will probably remember this, when the Revitalization Act of 1993 came out. And so this actually was signed into law. And the Revitalization Act was the law that required that women and minorities be included as subjects in clinical research funded by the NIH. Okay, so there's some key things, because I'll come back to this later. The law was for clinical research funded by the NIH. So it's very specific. But we know the intent was a very good intent. All right, so after that was passed into law in '83. Where are we at now? So some more recent studies. So this was one that looked at federally funded trials published in 2009 and found that 76% of the trials did enroll both men and women. Shocking that it's still not 100%. But females only represented 37% of the enrollment. And 64% of the studies did not even state the results by sex. Clinical trials on statin use. So I already showed you there's key differences between the sexes with statins. So in the 1990s, 19% of those trials had women enrolled. And by the 2000s, we had it up to 31%. And another study that from the orthopedic literature showed that there was an increase in sex-specific analysis from 19 to 30%. So we still have a long way to go. So then I would say, well, what's the root of this problem? So I will say this is our drug development pipeline that I think many in this room are very familiar with. So when you're starting to develop a new therapy, right, we will do our research down here, our basic science research, often starting on testing in cells. And then as that's going well, you'll translate this into your animal research. And then when that's going well, you're going to do your clinical trials in humans. One of the issues, in my opinion, is that we've had a focus on the human clinical trial phase from the Revitalization Act, but we have had absolutely no focus on these earlier stages of the pipeline, leaving investigators to really do whatever they want in studying and developing these therapies. And if you actually think about the economics of it, it is this stage that is very costly. I mean, very costly to do human clinical trials. And if you look at all the money that's put into that, compared to how much money is put into animal and cell research. So if we would focus on studying both sexes at these earlier stages of the pipeline, I believe we would be better informed going into the clinical trial phase. Because guess what? Most clinical trials fail. Most clinical trials are negative clinical trials. Okay, so what do we do? All right, so when I was still in Chicago, I just came here 2 years ago, and before that I was in Chicago. So two of my residents, we decided to look at this. Again, I'm a surgeon, so we looked in the surgical literature. And so we wanted to see if there was sex bias in the basic and translational surgical research. And we hypothesized that there was. And so what did we do? We went to 5 of our common surgery journals. And you can see these are our 5 common surgery journals here. And we basically looked at every single publication in all 5 of these journals over a 2-year period, 2011 and 12. And we abstracted data from the publications, and importantly, if it was a sex-specific disease like ovarian, testicular, and then the number of animals, the sex of the animal or the cell, etc. What did we find? So we had about 2,300 articles, and after excluding the human data, because we wanted to look specifically at the cell and animal data, we had 618 articles. Now I'm going to tell you, there are several things that we found that I was not expecting. This first data point. So you guys, these are papers that were published, I want to remind you, in 2011 and 12. Okay, so relatively recently. 22% of published manuscripts did not state the sex of the cell or the animal. 22%. So I was a little surprised. I did not expect to see that number as high as this. We got a lot of investigators and writers in this room, and I'm sure peer reviewers. Now, of the 78% that stated the sex of the cell or the animal that they did, oh, excuse me, this is just animals. Sorry, let me point that out. 22% did not state the sex of the animal they researched on, okay? Of the 78% that did, 80% used only male animals in their research. 17% used females, and a little tiny 3% used both male and female animals. Now the issue with the cell research, little different. For cells, 76% did not state the sex of the cell they were using in their research. Now, I know many of you are thinking, well, come on, I bought those cells. They're a cell line. I got them from a company, right? Okay, because I get that. But then my response is, sorry, there was a sex of that cell from the beginning, and it is clearly stated even if you purchase your cell line. And when we study male and female cells in a petri dish, we know that there can be very significant differences. So it's very important to still state this. Now, of the 24% that did state the sex of their cell, same pattern. 71% are studying their therapies on male cells only, 21% female only, and 7% on both. Okay, so then the next question was, well, what about those researchers who are working on therapies for diseases that we know are prevalent in females? So you remember that slide that I showed you where there's no differences? Well, so cardiovascular and thyroid, clearly there are diseases that are very prevalent in women. Statistically, there's several of us with thyroid disease in this room. I'm one of them. But so if we looked at just the papers with cardiovascular disease and thyroid in the surgical literature, here's what we found. We had 45 papers. 44% did not state the sex of the animal or the cell that they were studying. And of those that did, it was actually worse. 88% male only. Okay, and then we asked one further question. After seeing all this data, we then said, well, okay, how are we doing over time? Are we getting better with this practice? Are we getting worse? Is it the same? So then we went back and looked at all the papers in 2001 and 1991 in those journals. And here's what we found. We're getting worse with this practice over time and studying more and more male-only studies. So again, a lot of things I wasn't expected that I was going to find when we started this project. All right, so what are the implications of this practice? Well, one, drugs could be developed that are just flat out ineffective for women. I know that's a grandiose statement, but you will see when I present you some more things here. Drugs could be developed that have unintended side effects in women. You saw that slide I showed you with cardiovascular drugs, all the drugs that have adverse effects in women. Drugs that show no efficacy in the male cells and male animals may be dropped and not pursued further. And they could be effective in females. And then drugs that are studied in both sexes, okay, if they report the data in aggregate but don't do sex-based reporting of the data, we may not know if it's better in one sex or the other. So these are some of the implications. All right, so now you're probably going, what about all those human papers that we excluded in the first time? So we wanted to know what was going on with the human clinical surgical research. All right, so it's a little bit different. So this time we looked at the 1,668 papers that had humans in their published literature. Okay, this is what we found. Again, a little surprising, 17% of published studies did not state the sex of the human being researched. Now, of the 83% or so that did state the sex of the human, some good news. We actually do have 78% that were including male and females in their work. Now, again, I don't know where the unspecified falls. And we had 1% that were males only and 3% females only. We also looked at the absolute numbers. And so this was good. The absolute numbers from the articles that stated the sex actually had more females than males. Again, I don't know where the 9% will fall. So it could be equal. I don't know. But at least this is encouraging. Now, the problems with the human clinical research, I think, are two in my opinion. And I'll show you what we found. So we then decided to ask the question, well, all right, for the studies that have both males and females, are they matching the inclusion of males and females? So meaning, if it's 100% match, there'd be 50 males and 50 females. And if it's a 50% match, it would be 50 males and 25 females or vice versa. Okay, just trying to match the inclusion. Look what we found. So with something as liberal as just a 50% match, still we only had 45% of the papers that matched the inclusion of the sex. And if you go for something a little bit more stringent, if you even just say 80% match, only 18% of the papers did. So there's unequal inclusion of the sexes. And then we looked at, well, how often for the human research are the authors doing sex-based reporting of the data? So again, if they're studying a drug, did they report in aggregate, but also how did it work in males, how did it work in females? Only 38% of the time did we see sex-based reporting. How often did they statistically analyze the data by sex? Only 33%. And how often did they include a discussion about sex-based results? Only 23%. So these are the issues with human clinical research, in my opinion, in today's day and age. And I'm not the only one. So here's a report that came out in 2015 from the Government Accountability Office. And they actually do acknowledge, so despite the NIH Revitalization Act and the increased female enrollment in clinical trials, sex-based reporting and analysis of results remains an area of disparity. And I'm going to say this is my most important slide. Did you guys realize that 80% of the drugs that are removed from the market are removed because of a greater adverse reaction in women? That's what happens if you're developing and studying therapies in mostly males. Some surprising statistics, and I know this is a great audience to be hearing this talk. And then for adverse effects, the odds of an adverse drug reaction in women is about 50% greater than men, and women are more likely to be hospitalized due to an adverse drug reaction. So these really kind of bring it home, the importance of this. Okay, so how do we fix this problem? So I would say increased awareness. So, and it gets back to whenever I'm asked to give this talk, I pretty much say yes, because I believe it's a really important topic. And I think we need to increase awareness with the investigators. There are many investigators who've just never thought about this. I was one of them. I, grew up doing my postdoc research, and I was told to just always order male animals and control for that variable of sex. I never questioned it. And you're going to see it's going to come out a little bit later. So I think it's really important that we get increased awareness by the investigators. Physicians. Most physicians also have not thought about this, and they're treating patients and taking care of them. And again, it's just not on the radar. And really, patients. Whenever I give this talk to a lay audience, the first question that comes up at the end is usually this. But Dr. Kibbe, I don't understand. If my doctor prescribed that drug, I assume it's been tested in both sexes. Because of the inherent trust in the medical system. Now, on increasing awareness. So when I was at Northwestern, and I was working with Teresa Woodruff, so she runs the Women's Health Research Institute at Northwestern, and she got many of us investigators together, and we thought that this was a really important topic. Now, mind you, many other people have also been working on this topic across the country to impact a change. Well, we decided that in order to impact change, because nothing had really been happening on this, is that we needed to get a national platform for the topic. So we wrote away to a whole bunch of different news platforms, and sure enough, the producer for Leslie Stahl actually responded and said Leslie Stahl thinks this is important and she wants to do a story. So again, I'll tell you, this is my first and really only time I've gotten into advocacy, but it's a beautiful thing when you can see what happens.
How interesting, it's only one woman, she's the one that responded.
Yeah, I know, right?
That's not how coincidental.
Right, Leslie Stahl and her producer, I know, right? Interesting. So I'm going to show you a brief clip from 60 Minutes that aired. And if you want to see the rest, you can, but here we go.
Early last year, the Food and Drug Administration made an unusual and surprising announcement. It cut the recommended dose of the most popular sleep drug in the country, Ambien, in half for women. It turns out men and women metabolize Ambien, known generically as Zolpidem, very differently, leaving women with more of the drug in their bodies the next morning, and therefore at a greater risk of impaired driving. Ambien, Zolpidem, is now the only prescription drug in the country with a different suggested dose for men and women. But we've discovered it is far from an isolated example of differences between the sexes we never imagined. More and more, scientists are realizing that the differences are dangerously understudied, and that pervasively and fundamentally, sex matters.
A few years ago, Dr. Kibbe was using her male rats to study the problem that occurs in people.
You're going to show
She explained that after common surgical procedures like balloon angioplasty, which opens up blocked arteries, scar tissue often grows and blocks them off again.
And this is scar tissue right here?
Yes.
She discovered that a drug called nitric oxide could prevent that process in her rats.
She is one of our superstars at Northwestern, a tremendous surgeon.
Teresa Woodruff is also a professor at Northwestern Medical School and heads their Women's Health Research Institute. One day at lunch, Dr. Kibbe told her about the success she'd been having with her treatment.
I said, oh, well, that's interesting. What happens, what are the similarities or differences between males and females? And she said, oh, well, I don't study females, I only study males.
She says, have you studied it in females? And I looked at her, blank-faced. I said, no, I'm studying it in male animals. She's like, Melina. And so she educated me.
Did she chastise you, or you want to be ashamed of yourself?
All of the above. Yeah, and she really got me thinking.
Woodruff challenged Kibbe to go back and try her study in female animals, giving her a grant through her institute to buy the additional rats.
Up until this lunch, did you, in your own mind, assume that male and females responded the same?
I did. I was shocked at the outcome.
I still remember the real epiphany moment when she came running into my office and said, there's a 180-degree difference between males and females. You know, that's powerful because that drug doesn't work the same in males and females, most likely. And so by uncovering this out of a lunch, we can change human health.
So the story is totally true, except for I don't think I went running into her office. But it's cute. But she really did. Teresa's the person who had such an impact by bringing this up with me. And what she did is she gave me a little small grant, $25,000, and I went and studied. I've been working on developing nitric oxide-based therapies for vascular disease. And it works fabulously, and I've been studying it for years, fine-tuning it in male animals. I then went and studied it in female animals, and what I found is it didn't work at all. I was horrified. I had to jack the dose way up before I got similar efficacy. So here I'd spent my whole career developing this, and I myself never thought to ask the most basic question, does it work the same in both sexes? So you can see why I've kind of become passionate about this topic. So the only other, since this is an interesting room, you guys would like this, the only other thing, you know, when you do these kind of stories, you get all the approvals, got the approval from my dean and everything. All the official people were there when we filmed. Guess what I got called to the principal's office on after it aired? Did you notice I was handling the rats without gloves? No one said anything, and I was not operating on it. They're like pets. So yeah, I was like, oh, I know. That was funny. It was kind of funny, though. I said I should have purple gloves for Northwestern. All right, so what's amazing is that, you know, what happened after we did get this national platform. Unbelievable. So have any of you, this story aired in February. By May, the NIH announced plans to develop a new policy that would require investigators to report their plans for the balance of male and female cells in animals in preclinical studies. Have you ever seen the NIH react that fast to anything? Unbelievable. So then we were waiting and waiting and waiting. That was 14. Teresa was great. She was going to DC, talking to different groups. Finally, in October of 15, it's like a year and a half later, this came out from the NIH, implementing rigor and transparency. If there's any active investigators in the room, I'm sure you're very aware of this, because this basically, starting January of 16, the requirement is that all research applications have to include sex as a variable, and it is now a score-deriving factor with the NIH. So that was great. So I sit on study section, and very interesting to watch what has been happening with this on my own study section. So June of 16, so really just 2 years ago, was the first study section with the new requirements. And I gotta say, these are some excerpts from grants I've reviewed in different study sections. This was just June of 18, but literally, folks would say this: we will attempt to use all male mice since the incidence of aneurysm development is higher in males. So this investigator is actually pointing out there's a difference between the sexes, but they still don't want to study both sexes. Okay, and here's one. Since no known differences have been reported in graft hyperplasia by sex, we will study only males. You have no idea how many things are wrong with that statement, because that's my area of research. Yes, there have been differences reported. And then I love this one. This was just a couple months ago. We will study male pigs. Yeah. These folks regret that I was probably their reviewer. They got their grants, just saying. But actually everyone, the NIH is taking it very seriously now. And after every grant, after the primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewer, the SRA will say, did the investigators consider sex as a variable? So for every grant, at least in my study section, they're doing that. So I applaud the efforts. Now, publication. It was fascinating to see what happened after we published the first study, the one on our on the cells and the animals that I showed you. So we published this, and then I was kind of watching the media and all the different little pickups, and we were, you know, doing some local news story and interviews and things like that. But one of my favorites, yeah, I'm not going to read it out loud. You can see that. Didn't even know this existed. It was kind of funny. But then my personal favorite pickup was this. So this is from the Italian newspaper. And my husband is Italian, and all of his family is in Rome, including his 95-year-old mom, who does not speak English, and I do not speak Italian. So one day, no joke, Marco's my husband, his brother, Guido, literally called him and said, guess what, Melina's in the paper. I'm like, what? So this, to me, was the most precious because, you know, Marco's the only one who came to America and married an American, and I was in the Rome paper, so Mommy could see it. So that was my personal favorite. All right, and then journals. So clearly, I think that journals have a role to play. You saw the data and how many publications didn't even state the sex of the human, animal, or cell. So I believe that journals should require all authors to provide a description of the sex being studied. And I think if there's a room of people who could help to have an impact on this topic, it is this room. And I would say that if only one sex is studied, a simple justification statement should be included for a single sex study. So I would say all of the surgery journals that I studied, they changed their instructions for authors a while ago after we put this out. I still think that all journals should require this. We're not there yet. I will say I'm part of, because I'm an editor as well for JAMA Surgery, and so I'm part of the Surgery Journal Editors Group, and we actually met last year. We meet every October, and this was one of our agenda items, and we got together and decided to put out a joint statement. And this just came out in July. A whole bunch of the surgical journals all put this statement out jointly together. So I was really proud of this. So slowly, we're getting there. It was a joint statement saying that we would all do this. Now the FDA. So I do think that the FDA has a role to play. I have a longer version of this talk, and I go a little bit more into the FDA and how I really feel. But let me just, so this was a toned down version. So I will just say that I do believe that the FDA, they should require all new drug applications to include the study of both sexes, which they do, and provide sex-based reporting of the data. And I believe that all clinical trials should balance the enrollment of men and women and conduct sex-based reporting of the data. This is still an issue today of balancing enrollment of subjects into clinical trials. It is definitely an issue. Now the FDA, after the 60-minute story aired and the NIH in May announced their plans to develop a policy, the FDA came out with this. The FDA Action Plan to enhance the collection and availability of demographic subgroup data. Yeah, that fell short in my opinion. Then, about a year ago, the FDA came out with this, Women's Health Research Roadmap. So, they came up with 7 research priority goals. Look at number 1, advance safety and efficacy. Advance the safety and efficacy and reduce the toxicity of FDA-regulated products used by women. I'm sorry, I thought that was their job. Right? Again, how many more drugs should be looked at? And this needs to be evaluated. If you want the gotcha moment on 60 Minutes, it's there with the FDA. Now, industry-funded research. So there is currently no mandate or policy for industry-funded research. They basically have to just follow the requirements of the FDA and if they're submitting new drug applications. So I believe that the same guidelines that apply to government-funded research, remember the Revitalization Act is to NIH-funded research. I think that they should apply to industry-sponsored clinical trials, given that what's the bulk of clinical trials? Industry-sponsored. And then lastly, the government. So I will say that the government, this is very interesting. I do not know this congressman. He's from Tennessee. But after the 60-minute story and the NIH and all that stuff aired, Jim Cooper proposed the Research for All Act of 2015. And basically this has requirements for both the FDA and the NIH about balancing the investigation and inclusion of males and females. And I keep checking on the website to see how many have signed up to support it. I'm fearful that it's just going to get folded into something else. But so when people ask me how they can help support this, I tell them to contact their representatives and support it. So in summary, what I will say is that hopefully I showed you guys that sex really does matter, that research is fraught with sex bias. Of the manuscripts that stated the sex of the animal or cell, 80% were studying only males and developing their therapies. And when it came to human surgical research, there needs to be better inclusion of both sexes. And the data should be reported and analyzed by sex. I do think there's a need for more awareness of this topic. And I do think that there are some additional policy changes that could occur. Now, I'm going to end with one other little video. So after the 60 Minutes aired and the NIH report came out, 60 Minutes re-aired this story. And then literally, I was coming home one night from a flight, and I was getting all these text messages when I landed saying, Melina, you were on the Colbert Report. And I ignored it. I thought it was a joke. Sure enough, Colbert picked up the story. And he did an amazing job capturing this story. So I'm going to show you this clip.
It's not just mindless adoration, folks. I need it. And I want to thank you for singling me out for your applause. It makes me feel special as an individual. Because frankly, I'm sick and tired of hearing about equality. Equality rights for gays, equal pay for women, equal space for equal. And now, Obama's equalocrats over at the National Institutes of Health are directing scientists to perform their experiments with both female and male animals. Co-ed lab rats? That's a bad idea. You just know, late at night, they're going to hook up at work, then it's going to be awkward around the water bottle the next day. You see, traditionally, folks, when scientists tested drugs on mice or rats, they were usually male. Seems natural enough. The female rats are all being used to test cosmetics. But, looking good. All right. But of course, there's another reason the female rats were left out of the experiments.
Turns out female rats also have those pesky hormones.
So to control for that variable, most researchers study just males.
You gotta leave the females out. Any scientist knows it's crucial to eliminate extraneous variables, like half the global population. But apparently, folks, turns out that omission created a few whoopsie daisies, like Ambien dosage. Ambien was put on the market after extensive testing 20 years ago, but just last year, the FDA told women to cut their doses in half because new studies showed they metabolize the active ingredient more slowly than men do. Unfortunately, a lot of those women didn't hear the FDA because they were asleep for some reason. And now, they're blaming the rats.
Not studying both male and female animals results in more problems for women down the road.
If the whole darn pipeline is male-dominated and sex differences truly do matter, how can it not be the case that you're going to end up with, on average, a lot more negative side effects in women than in men?
So, women should be grateful for bonus side effects. I mean, this time it's being sleepy, but next time it might be invisibility or heat vision. And this long-standing tradition of testing on only male subjects is based on the underlying assumption that females are simply a variation on a theme. Folks, that's science. Male is default human. All right, if you want bells and whistles like the bumpy bits in front or all that fancy plumbing down there, it comes at a price, ladies. For instance, we don't make medicine for you. And after all, how are we supposed to? Women are too complicated. That's why they're not allowed on boats. Their gyno pieces make compasses go crazy. Don't believe me? Then why are their insides shaped exactly like the Bermuda Triangle? Lost a lot of good men in there.
So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to come and present to you guys.